Thank you very much. Our speaker this morning is Dr. David Rasnick, and his degrees are actually in chemistry, in organic chemistry from Georgia Tech. And he spent a number of years in industry. He has actually designed and made various protease inhibitors intended at other diseases than AIDS, and he became interested in AIDS in the early 80s and has spent a good deal of time studying it ever since. He's had a very interesting life, which I'm not going to go through with you here, but in 2000 he was on the committee which advised the president in South Africa, Thabo Mbeki. And he's going to talk a little bit today about Africa, and then also specifically about the drugs, which is an area of expertise for him. So I give you Dr. David Rasnick.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. The first time I've been up here, and this nice winding road and up in the trees and everything, and the cool air. It's enjoyable. I put, oops, I knew that was going to happen eventually. 20 copies of our latest paper, The Chemical Basis of the Various AIDS Epidemics, that we published just last June in the Journal of Biosciences. And so if anybody wants it, there's in the back, and there were a few up front. And I can always send you some more, and you can send you a PDF of it if you want via email. So let's get right into it. This is normally about an hour talk, but I'm going to limit it to 30 minutes so that we have plenty of time for discussion. Whenever Peter Duesberg and I present the mountain of evidence that the contagious HIV hypothesis of AIDS is the biggest scientific medical blunder of all time, we're generally interrupted fairly early with the question, but what about Africa? Peter's going to be here. He was supposed to be here today, but he was in Italy doing a TV interview, so we swapped places. He's going to be here next Tuesday, and he will give you a lot of that evidence that criticizes the contagious HIV hypothesis. But for now, let me just let's take a quick look at the kinds of arguments that generally lead to, but what about Africa? Before 1984, the AIDS mainstream actually accepted that AIDS satisfied all the criteria for a lifestyle or an environmentally caused phenomenon or syndrome. And the reason was very simple, because AIDS satisfied all the criteria. And one of the most important criteria is the non-random distribution of diseases, which is typical of a lifestyle or environmental disease or phenomenon. For example, the quintessential AIDS-defining disease, Kaposi sarcoma, or KS right here, 98% of it is restricted to gay men. Children don't get it, hemophiliacs don't get it, IV drug users don't get it, and that's true still to this day. And then we have lymphoma, which is an AIDS-defining disease, and it's restricted to gay men and those that take AZT. More about that later. Bacterial pneumonia is, you don't see it in the gay men that much, but you see it in children and in Africans. Tuberculosis pretty much doesn't exist it's not a problem in American AIDS patients, but it certainly is among IV drug users, children, and Africans. And more about that later since TB is now the same thing as AIDS in Africa. And then other things. And the thing to know about hemophiliacs and blood transfusion recipients, that about the only AIDS-defining diseases that they ever show up with are yeast infections and pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. So we have a very smart virus here. It knows to cause Kaposi sarcoma in gay men. It knows whether you're gay or straight, white or black, male or female, even what zip code you live in. AIDS in San Francisco to this date is still restricted to the same city blocks that it first appeared in 1981, and that's in the Castro district. Another hallmark of a lifestyle disease is the time course of its appearance and disappearance. The very lethal and contagious London plague of 1665 appeared and disappeared in a matter of a few months. On the other hand, the non-contagious plague of lung cancer in the United States has already spanned decades and shows no sign of declining yet. And we pretty much understand the difference between a contagious disease and a non-contagious disease because of the time course, the non-randomness of appearance, and many other things that a person can look at. Peter will go into that later. The time course of AIDS resembles a lifestyle phenomenon. It started with very small numbers in the early 80s, rose to a peak around 1992, 93. This is from the CDC's own website. You can go there and get this data. And then it's been declining until about 1996 or 97 when the protease inhibitor cocktails were first widely available, and then it's flattened out, actually. The decline stopped. Decline in deaths and decline in AIDS stopped after the appearance of these drugs. You'll also see here in this line, this is AIDS funding. The U.S. taxpayers have been footing the bill on this. Through the end of this year, American taxpayers will have spent $132 billion on AIDS and haven't saved the first AIDS patient. In fact, they use that fact to raise more money. The fact that they say, well, we need more because we haven't saved anybody yet. And by way of comparison, Americans spent, and I grant you it's different money, it was 1960s, spent $22 billion to put 12 men on the moon. But we know we got our money's worth for it because we actually saw them on the moon, saw the movies. The widely held view that AIDS was due to a lifestyle phenomenon, was abruptly changed in April 23rd, 1984 at a press conference, where at that time, at that press conference, AIDS officially became contagious, sexually transmitted, caused by a harmless retrovirus that we call HIV that had originated in Africa. In fact, Robert Gallo, the fellow who brought HIV to world attention, predicted or claimed that AIDS probably came from Africa. Have you ever noticed that there's no red, white, and blue catastrophes? They always come from China or Africa or someplace like that. And even if we have mad cow disease, we immediately have to say, no, it came from Canada. You know, we never have a good old homegrown disease except AIDS. AIDS is the only one that we really invented, I guess. But as early as November 1984, African AIDS made the cover of Newsweek. Can Black Africa be saved? The dire predictions about Africa haven't let up. In fact, they've only accelerated over the years. There was an issue in Lancet a couple of years ago, 2002. Experts predict global devastation due to HIV/AIDS. We hear this all the time. It's a never-ending, relentless litany. And then also in the same issue, the consequences of AIDS stand to undermine all efforts to promote development in Africa. They expect the whole populations are going to decrease, economies are going to fall down. President Clinton in 2000 made AIDS a threat to the national security of the United States. And we can get into that a little later, how that came about. To set the stage for what comes next, here is a simple equation that defines AIDS according to the CDC's definition of what AIDS is in the United States and Europe. Any of these diseases, and even more, these are just the more common ones, and a non-disease up here, plus antibodies to HIV equals AIDS. This equation does not apply to Africa, though. And the reason is very simple, because Africans don't suffer from these American AIDS diseases. And there's another reason. The HIV antibody tests are too expensive. They cost about $50 a pop to do, and the typical annual health care budget per African is about $8 a year on average in sub-Saharan Africa. So you see $50 to do an HIV test is prohibitively expensive. But even more important, the tests are useless in Africa anyway. And there are over 60 known published in the mainstream literature, published ways that a person can be false positive, have false positive antibodies to HIV, who's never been exposed to HIV. And I've highlighted just a few. This list is just to give you a flavor of what it is. Just naturally occurring antibodies from your historical experience and being exposed to viruses and various things. Tuberculosis cross-reacts extensively. And this is important since tuberculosis is a disease of poverty and quite common in sub-Saharan Africa, and is an AIDS-defining disease in Africa now. A cold or a flu will give you a false positive, or a flu vaccination will. Viral vaccines. Pregnancy, this is an important one, because virtually all of the HIV test studies for the prevalence of HIV antibodies in Africa are done on pregnant women, prenatal clinics. And yet pregnancy is one of the leading causes of false positive antibodies to HIV. That's never discussed in the public literature. Malaria, imagine that. Hepatitis B, 98% of all sub-Saharan Africans acquire hepatitis B as children. and if they're healthy, but they're antibody positive to hepatitis B, and hepatitis B cross-reacts with these tests. Most people don't know that there is no such thing as an AIDS test. They talk about AIDS tests, but the tests themselves tell you that they cannot be used to diagnose either AIDS or HIV. There's no test for HIV, in fact, even though we hear these tests are HIV tests. They're antibody tests, like the ELISA test, this one here, for example. And even according to the test itself and the manufacturers, they're not even tests for antibodies to HIV. For example, the sensitivity and specificity. At present, there is no recognized standard for establishing the presence or absence of antibodies to HIV-1 or HIV-2 in human blood. In other words, they don't know what these things are diagnosing. And yet people use the anti-HIV antibodies as being equivalent to being a test for, first of all, antibodies to HIV, second, as a presence of active or HIV infection, and third, as a diagnosis of AIDS, that you're going to come down with diarrhea, pneumonia, dementia, cervical cancer, or lymphoma 10 years down the road and die from it. Now, I should say some of people in this audience may immediately object and say, oh, but the so-called viral load test detects HIV. That's not true. The FDA specifically excludes the use of the viral load test to either diagnose AIDS or even the presence or absence of HIV, because nobody knows really what those tests are measuring. Since the HIV antibody test is too expensive and completely useless for diagnosing AIDS or HIV or even antibodies to HIV, AIDS Incorporated had to come up with another way. I call it AIDS Incorporated because of all the money that's been spent, the $132 billion of taxpayer money. Abbott Laboratories makes about $1 billion a year on its HIV test. Glaxo makes about $1 billion on its anti-HIV drugs. So it's a big business. So they had to come up with another way of labeling Africans with the death sentence of AIDS and maintain this illusion, it truly is illusion, and I'll justify that in a moment, of an AIDS holocaust in Africa. The WHO and the Centers for Disease Control met at a little town called Bangui in the Central African Republic in October of 1985 to come up with a definition of AIDS in Africa. And here's what they did. They just came up with a clinical diagnosis. They renamed this arbitrary list of long-established indigenous diseases as African AIDS. Fever, persistent cough, diarrhea, weight loss, and since the middle 1990s, TB. If you have those things, you're an AIDS case. Here is a AIDS reporting form from Uganda, but it's typical of all of sub-Saharan Africa. South Africa has virtually the same form here. Notice that, if you're reporting an AIDS case, these are the major signs. Weight loss, at least 10%. Diarrhea, at least 1 month. Fever, at least 1 month. I was in the Peace Corps in Papua New Guinea. I had all of these major signs. That would have made me an AIDS case in Papua New Guinea. But fortunately, on returning to the United States, since Americans do not recognize the Bangui symptoms as AIDS in the United States, just by landing on our soil, I would no longer be considered an AIDS case. In fact, because of the completely different definitions of AIDS, one way to, overnight, if we want to spend billions of dollars, overnight we could instantly cure the African AIDS patients if we all bought them an airplane ticket, flew them to the United States, and then cure all the American AIDS patients by buying them a plane ticket and send them to Africa, because by definition they don't have AIDS anymore because they don't have the same symptoms. And the WHO, according to the WHO and the CDC, because of this, there are two very different AIDS epidemics in the world. We have these for the United States and European countries and Canada and Australia. They all sort of show this little arc. The United States certainly is the leading one, of rising to a peak around 92, 93 and coming down. Same true with these other countries. But then here in Africa, we have AIDS rising to somewhere in the early 1990s and then plateauing or leveling off. The WHO, the World Health Organization, says that, reports in their publications, that annually there's about 75,000 new AIDS cases in sub-Saharan Africa every year. And you can see here the difference between this plateauing of AIDS and yet the HIV estimates, again, from these pregnant women just keep rising. Now this flies in the face of what we read with the authority of the New York Times, that there are over 40 million HIV positive people in the world, 23 million have died. But those numbers, what a lot of people don't know, that those numbers do not represent actual AIDS cases or AIDS deaths. Those numbers only exist in computer models in Geneva, Switzerland, Bethesda, Maryland, and Atlanta, Georgia. So, I'll just read this. We move to South Africa. Faced with the dire predictions of an AIDS holocaust in South Africa, coupled with the complete disconnect between AIDS in Africa and the white world, Thabo Mbeki went to great trouble and expense to bring 50 of the world's leading AIDS experts to South Africa in 2000 to help his government understand the true nature of AIDS and what to do about it. And because of his recent experience with apartheid, he knew that it was important to include dissenting voices, because they were not allowed for decades in South Africa. 1/3 of Mbeki's AIDS panel were scientists and doctors from all around the world who criticized or questioned the AIDS dogma. And while we were having these panel discussions in Pretoria and Johannesburg in the spring and summer of 2000, there were a lot of other people out in the streets who did not tolerate questions or criticism. And this was happening at the same time. In Durban, there was a AIDS conference, World AIDS Conference was in Durban, South Africa at the same time the second panel convened in Johannesburg. AIDS is primarily a political and sociological phenomenon. It has precious little to do with science and medicine. There are powerful forces that do everything they can to prevent me from even talking here. For example, there are people who advocate that we should be jailed, that the Constitution of the United States should be changed so that we can't speak about these things. And even there's those that advocate one bullet, one dissident. And these are people that care about all these lives that are being lost in Africa. While protesters were chanting one bullet, one dissident, observers of Mbeki's AIDS panel made this observation, which you can get online from the government of South Africa and in the interim report of our deliberations. It said the deliberations of the panel were at all times bedeviled by the absence of accurate and reliable data and statistics on the magnitude of the AIDS problem or even HIV prevalence in South Africa. Repeated requests for such data and statistics failed to result in the provision of such data by either South African panelists or the officials of the Department of Health. In fact, that was one of the very first questions that we raised when we were there. How many AIDS cases and how many AIDS deaths are there in South Africa? To this day, we don't have an answer to that. It was total silence for about 5 minutes. And finally, somebody from South Africa stood up and said, "I'm sorry, we don't know, we don't keep those statistics." They still don't have those statistics. After 2 decades of AIDS, this is what we know for sure about AIDS in Africa. From 1980 to 2000, sub-Saharan Africa gained 274 million people, equivalent to the population of the United States, which took us several centuries to acquire. By 2001, the World Health Organization, not relying on models, but using the Bangui definition of AIDS, reported a cumulative total of 1.09 million AIDS cases over the 20 years of AIDS in Africa. The 1 million AIDS cases would be dwarfed by the overwhelming population growth and the fact that African AIDS diseases are indistinguishable from conventional African morbidity and mortality. That's what we know for sure. Now, the mainstream agrees that South Africa has the best statistics in Africa. So let's take a look and see what the statistics of South Africa tell us about AIDS, at least in South Africa. From Statistics South Africa, it's like their Census Bureau. I got this data. Anybody can get it online. You can download it yourself and make any plots that you want with the data. This shows that the population of South Africa grew at a constant about 2% annual rate from 1994 to 2001. This is the current data. And you notice down here that deaths from all causes similarly rose at a low rate, but a low rate, but it was proportional to the gain in the population, which what you would exactly expect. You're all scientists in here, I understand, students of science. you know that if one thing goes up, something else is proportional to it, it's got to go up a little bit too. It shouldn't change. If we had an AIDS holocaust, or if there was this overwhelming depletion of a population or consequences of supposedly the largest plague catastrophe since the Black Death of Europe, then this line here should start going up at some point. We hear all the time about the increased numbers of AIDS cases and AIDS deaths in Africa, and South Africa certainly a lot. All right? How they do that is that it's a zero-sum game. You no longer call your TB deaths TB. You call them AIDS deaths. That's how you can have the total number of deaths not changing, by just reclassifying pneumonia as AIDS, or TB as AIDS, or diarrhea or weight loss as AIDS, poverty as AIDS, basically. That's what's going on. Here's a study of the prevalence of two supposedly sexually transmitted diseases, syphilis and HIV. We're told this. I don't think there's too much dispute about syphilis being sexually transmitted. So if both of these, and they're both said to be transmitted exactly the same way, sexual contact, blood transfusions, no difference between the two. And yet there is no correlation. In fact, there's an anti-correlation in place between syphilis and HIV. The red is the prevalence of syphilis and blue is HIV, and these were the various provinces in South Africa. We have the highest level of HIV in KwaZulu-Natal, which is basically a Zulu region, mostly black and poor. And we have the highest levels of antibodies to HIV and the lowest prevalence of syphilis. Conversely, in the Western Cape, which is fairly affluent, largely white, we have the highest prevalence of syphilis and the lowest prevalence of HIV. So we have this X plot here. They don't correlate in place. And this was in 2000. In 2001, it's pretty much the same thing. But notice there is one little difference. The syphilis, levels of syphilis in the Western Cape came down tremendously in 2001 because the government instituted a program to try to reduce the prevalence of sexually transmitted diseases throughout the country. And because Western Cape is one of the most affluent areas, it had its greatest effect. So the syphilis did indeed come down. But HIV didn't change. So their efforts to change sexually transmitted syphilis worked, but it didn't have any effect at all on the prevalence of HIV. There's also a problem with the time course between syphilis and HIV. This again is from the antenatal clinics, the prenatal clinics in South Africa, to get both the rise in HIV over the years from 1990 to 2001. And remember I told you that the government instituted a program to try to reduce sexually transmitted diseases. It started around 1997. And here's the syphilis. The syphilis has gone down during this period. They actually had an effect on it. But they had no effect on the prevalence of antibodies to HIV during this period. And yet they should have had an effect. Condoms and things like that, preaching safe sex and all these other sorts of things should have had an effect on HIV, and it didn't. Similar results to this one and the previous slide are reported in Uganda and Thailand, the exact same disconnect, these X plots. But haven't protease inhibitor cocktails lowered mortality since 1996? Now you're saying, okay, there's a problem with African AIDS, but protease cocktails must be sure evidence that people are living longer and everything, and due to these drugs. It may come as a shock to you, it should, that not one anti-HIV drug clinical trial has shown that HIV-positive people taking the drugs live longer or at least better lives than a similar group not taking the drugs. In fact, the opposite is true. And I challenge anybody in this room to find a published study of a clinical trial that shows that just that proves me wrong there. I've looked for many, many years, and I follow this on a daily basis, and there are no such studies. The anti-HIV drugs, on the other hand, actually, are a leading cause of AIDS diseases and death among HIV-positive Americans and Europeans. A 30-year study that was published in the Journal of American Medical Association in 1998 concluded that every year prescription drugs used properly kill over 100,000 and seriously injure more than 2 million Americans, making these reactions between the fourth and the sixth leading cause of death. At its peak, AIDS claimed about 50,000 lives a year, and virtually everyone had been taking toxic drugs of some sort. If you're HIV positive, your AZT comes in a bottle with this pleasant white and blue label on it. If you're a scientist and you order the same material, AZT, you get a bottle, for example, from Sigma Chemical Company, with this label on it, with Jolly Roger, the skull and crossbones, and with this warning on the side, and I have it here for easy reading. Toxic by inhalation, in contact with skin, and if swallowed, target organs, blood, bone marrow, and if you feel unwell, seek medical advice, show the label, where possible, wear suitable protective clothing. You cannot find this warning on this bottle. See, and here's just a typical AIDS, HIV positive person who was healthy, and he was given AZT, and it killed him. Caesar Schmidt was healthy in 1992 when he started AZT. He developed nausea, diarrhea, weight loss, all AIDS-defining diseases, by the way, and also all consequences of AZT. In 1994, he stopped his AZT and his symptoms disappeared. However, in 1998, Schmitz developed lymphoma and died, and which is a common consequence of AZT. In fact, the NCI published a paper in 1993, first author Pluta, that indicated that people have about a 50% chance of developing lymphoma 36 months after starting AZT. Here are some of the AIDS-defining diseases that are caused by the anti-HIV drugs. AIDS-defining, immunodeficiency. We're giving powerful immune deficiency-causing drugs to treat an immune deficiency disease. Leukopenia, fever, dementia, weight loss, lymphoma, diarrhea, death, anemia, neutropenia. These are non-AIDS defining, protease paunch, muscle atrophy, mitochondrial dysfunction, hepatitis, birth defects, nephritis, lactic acidosis, which can be very lethal, and even heart problems. And I won't go through this. The same thing, these are HIV-free babies that were given these drugs, and also humans, and they come down with that same list of diseases. HAART, or the highly active antiretroviral therapy, appeared in 1996. That's when it was approved by the FDA, but it wasn't completely widespread available until a year later, 1997. And let's see, check my notes on this. All right. Yet people have credited, notice AIDS peaked up here in 92, 93, it's been coming down. The AIDS deaths followed that because the causes of the deaths were declining. And yet people have credited the introduction of HAART, or the protease inhibitor cocktails, with the decline in AIDS deaths. They didn't say anything about AIDS itself, but in AIDS deaths. But notice, I got this data, this curve out here, just 2 days ago. I just wanted to make sure I had the most updated data from the CDC. You get this from their 2002 HIV/AIDS surveillance report. This is right on the cover, very first page, so you don't have to look very far. You see that AIDS now has flattened out around since 1997 or there's about, and so has AIDS deaths. This is after the introduction of the life-saving protease inhibitor cocktails. They attributed the decline in these deaths to the introduction of these drugs, and yet after these drugs are available, widespread available, you now don't see, you see a leveling off of AIDS deaths, which you can make a fairly strong case. In fact, when you look at the literature and toxicity of it, why they're introducing, drug holidays and structured treatment interruptions and everything, it's because of this very fact, is that the drugs are hurting, causing people AIDS-defining diseases and killing them. Another reason for the decline in the AIDS deaths since around 1993, which a lot of people don't know, is that the CDC's changed the definition of what it means, what AIDS is in the United States about 4 or 5 times. And the last major definition change was 1993, where they included for the first time large numbers of asymptomatic people, healthy people. They had no symptoms. They didn't have any of these diseases. 97 was the last year that the CDC published AIDS-defining diseases. How many people had pneumocystis? How many people had candidiasis? And so on and so forth. And that year, 61% of all new AIDS cases had none of the AIDS-defining diseases. They only had the results of 2 laboratory tests. 61% of these new AIDS cases. They had antibodies to HIV, which nobody knows what in the world that means, and they had fewer than 200 CD4 cells per microliter of blood. That now, by definition, is full-blown AIDS in the United States. Otherwise, they have no symptoms of disease. When you add large numbers of otherwise healthy people to a supposedly 100% fatal disease, guess what that does to the mortality rate? It plummets, it goes down. Whoops. Oh, well. The last one doesn't matter. I can just tell you my time's up anyway. It's 30 minutes. The last slide just was a study by one of the co-authors of our paper here, Klaus Kernlein, who had been treating AIDS patients since 1985 in Kiel, Germany, and he had 34 AIDS patients. And the only requirements to enter his program was that if they were taking recreational drugs, that they'd stop, and that they would not take in the anti-HIV drugs. He has an 8% mortality rate. 3 patients died last year, but they were really, really sick when they came in anyway. That compares with 61% mortality rate for Germany overall, where they treat people with the anti-HIV drugs. There aren't many studies like this because you can't get funding to do this. You can't get funding to actually demonstrate whether or not people live longer or at least better lives taking the anti-HIV drugs. The reason is because nobody really wants to know the answer. Well, I'll stop from there. Plenty of time for questions. Now, I understand a lot of you are pre-med or pre-dental. So this should pose a real dilemma for you. And I recommend that you totally forget everything I said if you want to go through medical school with a reasonable rapidity and without many hiccups. I know it's hard to unforget things, but believe me, honest to God, that's my advice. If you want to go through medical school and have a reasonably unproblematic life. Otherwise, you're going to have some serious problems thinking about this and wondering how much of what I said is true. I'm willing to stake my life on every word of it. But are you willing to stake your careers? That's the question. Yes?
So would you say AIDS exists at all then?
AIDS, yes. AIDS stands for Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. What AIDS is not, it is not contagious, it is not sexually transmitted, and it is not caused by HIV. But those AIDS-defining diseases do really exist, and there is such a thing as acquired immune deficiency. It's very well documented. Prior to 1981, when we had AIDS, first recognized in the United States, all acquired immune deficiency was well recognized, and it's still the same today. Malnutrition is the world's leading cause of AIDS-defining diseases anywhere. Second are drugs, chemotherapy for cancer. All of the AIDS-defining diseases, from pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, Kaposi's sarcoma, and all these others, every one of them has been known in people who took chemotherapy for cancer, for example. It depresses the immune system, it kills the cells in the bone marrow, and you have neutropenia, your white blood cell count goes down because of the drugs, and you get these so-called opportunistic infections. Doctors know why, because they know the drugs do this. That's one reason why you don't stay on chemotherapy for very long. Take it off or else you die from AIDS. Another one is organ transplant recipients. They're given things like cyclosporin A and other immune suppressive drugs to intentionally depress the immune system so that you don't lose the liver or the kidney. As a consequence, you'll get pneumocystis carinii pneumonia or other AIDS-defining diseases. Hemophilia, for example, just by injecting proteins in your blood depresses the immune system. It's been known for a long time. And you can get all sorts. You can get pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. In fact, all of these old AIDS methods, acquired immune deficiency syndrome methods of drugs for cancer, chemotherapy for organ transplantation, hemophilia, even starvation, also cause the inversion of the CD4, CD8 cell counts that the mainstream says, oh, that's clear, that's only AIDS, that's only HIV positive. It's documented in the literature that all of those things cause the same AIDS-defining inversion of CD4, CD8. So yes, acquired immune deficiency syndrome is real. It's not contagious. It's not sexually transmitted. It's not caused by HIV. It's principally caused by starvation and drugs. In fact, the anti-HIV drugs are a leading cause of AIDS in the United States. Yes?
And the people who have been diagnosed and have all these symptoms and have not been exposed to drugs or were not malnourished.
Right? Yes, exactly. Guess what you cannot find? You cannot find that exact study that you're talking about in the scientific medical literature. There is no study that shows that the only thing they have is antibodies to HIV, They're not drug users, they're not gay. And by gayness has, by the way, nothing to do with AIDS. It's their drug use that cause their AIDS. There is no study in the vast scientific medical literature that compares a group of HIV positive people to a similar group of HIV negative people, that only the HIV positive people got these diseases and HIV negative didn't. And there's no study that shows that only HIV antibodies by itself, in the absence of drugs or therapies or other thing like hemophilia, don't get AIDS. There's no such study. It's only, you hear these anecdotal stories. I've never met one of those people, and you cannot find them in the literature.
So are you interested in doing that study?
Yeah. Peter Duesberg has written 23 grant proposals in a row. Turned down every one of them. In order to do a study, you have to be funded. Somebody has to pay for it. He's sent in 3 applications to study the consequences of nitrite inhalants, the so-called poppers, which are why 98% of all AIDS Kaposi sarcoma is in gay men. It's in the mouth and the lungs. Guess what? They would inhale, like on the weekend, 15 milliliters of amylobutyl nitrite. I'm an organic chemist. I wouldn't open that stuff outside of a fume hood. Very toxic, carcinogenic, mutagenic material that these guys were inhaling 15 mils at a pop for years, 5 or 10 years, on weekends. You shouldn't be surprised that you would have lesions and problems with your lungs and with your face, and also explains why 98% of AIDS Kaposi sarcoma is in gay men, because that drug causes it. Somebody had one? I thought, okay, you.
Now, I'm kind of a novice when it comes to the HIV.
I'm sorry?
I'm kind of a novice when it comes to the HIV virus. So I was hoping you could tell me a little bit about like what it does exactly, and then how it stacks up when applied to Koch's postulate. Does it cause a disease itself?
Right.
Does it reduce? What does it do?
Nothing. It's one of, everybody in this room has 50 or 100 or 1,000 retroviruses in your genome. Your dog, your cat, your parakeet, your cows. All animals have retroviruses. If you look in molecular textbooks, probably on this campus, probably certainly at UC Berkeley, you'll see they call them retrotransposons, or retrovirus sequences in us. There's about 3,000 of these retroviruses that have been cataloged. They don't do anything. They were studied in the war on cancer in the 1970s as a possible cause of cancer, for the specific reason that they don't kill the cells that they infect. And HIV would be the only exception. It would be the only retrovirus that kills the cells that it infects. And in fact, it does not even kill those cells. Luc Montagnier, is public, the discoverer of HIV, says that HIV does not kill T cells, the cells that infect. There's a lot of literature. HIV does absolutely nothing. It's totally harmless. If HIV were a person, it would instigate the mother of all libel suits.
So my question is, I mean, since I'm a novice, how did I get to the understanding that it did kill immune system cells if it doesn't? I mean, has that been popular media or? Yeah,
basically, but it's the federal government, the United States, like I said, on April 23rd, we know when it happened, we know the exact date. April 23rd, 1984, Margaret Heckler, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, held a press conference where she paraded out Robert Gallo from the National Cancer Institute, a virologist who had been trying to make retroviruses the cause of all sorts of cancers and failed. Finally, has his retrovirus that now causes AIDS. He called it HTLV3 in those days. And he stole it from Luc Montagnier. It was another retrovirus that now we call HIV. And because of this press conference, and the federal government got behind it, and they all clicked their heels and saluted, and they said, okay, it's no longer a lifestyle disease, we're going to march off as a contagious sexually transmitted virally caused disease. And they put the weight and the prestige and the billions of dollars that the federal government could muster on it, and that's where we are today. And watch out for SARS. SARS is the very same thing. I doubt it will ever reach the same insanity that HIV did, but it's following in the same path of HIV. It's just total nonsense. Somebody over here? Yes.
Well, if a physician were to discourage all of his patients or prescribe his patients to not take the ABT, would they be accused of malpractice? Is it that bad?
I don't know. I don't know. There is a risk. I know that parents, for example, I've testified at court cases on this. Parents who see their kids dying on AZT, they were healthy generally when they started AZT, and then they started wasting away, their muscles swell up, their joints swell up the size of grapefruit, They can't eat anything, they're crying all the time. And I've testified in Maine for a mother who lost her daughter on AZT. And she saw her son going through the same thing. She took him off of it. In weeks, he got over it. He's still alive and healthy to this day. But the state was going to take him away and say, no, because we know better than you. You're not giving him these drugs, so you're not a good mother. We're going to give him these drugs. Well, fortunately, the state of Maine decided on the mother's behalf, and she kept her son, who's completely healthy now. This was back in '97, I believe it was. He should have been dead by now, according to AIDS mainstream. And he would have been dead by now had they taken the son away. Mothers that breastfeed their children, if they're HIV positive, they'll have their children taken away from them if they don't agree to stop taking them. There was in the 90s, and there could still be now, but certainly in the 90s, there was an underground railroad of mothers all around the world, leaving countries, leaving states, leaving cities, escaping from the medical Gestapo who's going to take their kids away or poison them. I know a lot of these mothers, personally. And I told them, don't tell me where you're going, I don't want to know. Because I can swear if somebody says, where are they? I don't know where they are. Now that has stopped. At least I haven't been involved in it since around 2000. But it's still going on. Yes?
So in a nutshell, you're saying that the whole AIDS epidemic is, number one, just for prestige and just for money, and number two, the American public has been lied to for the last...
That's pretty much it in a nutshell. One of the reasons, it started out as a mistake. 1984 was an election year. Remember President Reagan, that was his first year. He never said a word about AIDS. His first 4 years of his presidency were the first 4 years of AIDS. And it was an election year. And he completely disarmed the Democrats from using AIDS as a campaign issue with that April 23rd, 1984 press conference. Another, I think that's almost a quote, another great triumph for American medicine and science, Margaret Heckler said about Gallo. Here's the guy who's discovered the cause of AIDS, meaning your Reagan administration, and that you can expect a vaccine in 2 years, is what she said. And that would have made it into Reagan's second term in 1986. And sure enough, AIDS was not a campaign issue in 1984. And I think that's really why the Reagan administration had a press conference. They weren't trying to turn AIDS into another gigantic money engine. Unfortunately, it got going that way and it couldn't stop. The CDC jumped in on it, the NIH jumped in on it, and they didn't know how to stop it. And now it's gotten to the point where it's such a tremendous gravy train that nobody wants to stop it. There's 100,000 scientists and physicians that have built their careers, stake their reputations on it. We've killed tens of thousands of Americans with AZT. That's a pretty hard thing to admit, considering how long it took us to admit our mistake of imprisoning Japanese Americans during World War II. We've terrorized hundreds of millions of people around the world, equating sex with death. The United States has a tremendous ego. It would be very difficult for it at this late date to turn around and say, folks, sorry, we made a mistake and blew $132 billion.
I just want to verify two claims that I was hearing. The first one was about the syndrome AIDS, and just from microbiology classes, I understand that cold and different other viral infections manifest as syndromes also. And I'm wondering, because something has a complex etiology, or there isn't a one-to-one mapping between the disease and its causes, does that mean the syndrome doesn't exist? For instance, I understand common cold.
Of course not.
How would you deal with that? And has there been research to try to flesh out the etiology of AIDS?
Well, one thing about the flu is that it's hardly ever mistaken for dementia or Kaposi sarcoma or lymphoma or cervical cancer or any of these other diseases that we're attributing to HIV. So it has this little window. You know, I mean, the flu has flu symptoms, and we name the virus after a flu. Same thing with polio. We know polio doesn't cause the flu; it causes polio. You know, and the virus has a name for the thing that it causes. HIV is the only virus that doesn't have an HIV-specific disease.
There are many viruses that cause a cold, like
Yes.
there's not one-to-one.
And they're all the cold viruses.
So they're all.
And we know what they are. In fact, Peter Duesberg was the first one to map the genome of the flu virus anyway, and describe exactly where its variability comes from. And yet the flu always stays as the flu. You know it when you see it.
My second question for the second claim was, at first we were defining AIDS as a lifestyle phenomenon.
Right.
Is that correct?
Right.
I was wondering, what are the similarities between the lifestyle in, the San Francisco subculture and South Africa subculture? Has there been a study to verify that there are actually some similar lifestyle practices there?
Actually, totally different. That's why we have two different definitions for AIDS in the U.S. and Africa. If they were the same, we'd only need one definition. Right. The gay men in San Francisco that got AIDS, gayness has nothing to do with AIDS. Sex has nothing to do with AIDS. What made the gay men so prominent as AIDS, and still to this day, about 2/3 of all AIDS cases in the U.S. are still gay men, is because of their drug use. They use astronomical levels of nitrite inhalants and amphetamines and heroin and cocaine and stuff like that, far beyond what the population at large used. And they did it for like 5 or 10 years. You shouldn't be surprised if you drink a fifth of scotch a day that you're going to have central nervous system problems or digestive tract problems or some sort of problems, or if you smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day for 20 years. You shouldn't be surprised if you wind up with emphysema or lung cancer. You shouldn't be surprised if you take these kinds of drugs for a long period of time that you don't have some real serious problems, And that cost a lot of money. It was always these affluent guys that could travel around, New York, San Francisco, LA. Those were the hot spots of AIDS, and they were using these drugs a lot. The Africans are poor people. They don't have that money to spend on drugs. They don't know about them. I want to get over here and I'll come back over there.
What you're saying is true. It is absurd to believe that the government created AIDS to discourage promiscuity between heterosexuals, mostly homosexuals, and also the use of drugs. Is that?
I don't think that was. I really don't think that was the reason. I think it was a mistake that got out of hand. And then it's like AIDS there was no conspiracy to make this thing that we call AIDS now. I think it was simple fact that it was an election year thing and they just wanted to take it off the radar. Unfortunately, the other people saw a great opportunity here and they turned it into whatever their purposes, whatever they wanted to be. AIDS offers anything, whatever your taste is, AIDS will offer something to satisfy you, whether it's ethical, whether it's religious, whether it's medical, whether it's political, sociological, you take your pick. AIDS is every man's everything. So, I mean, I wouldn't put that in. That's not to say that there aren't people who don't use it for those purposes, but I don't think it started that way at all. You? Yeah.
So, based on what you're saying, is it true then, and have there been studies that indicate that AIDS shows up in drug users who are not gay? And
oh, yes,
in
absolutely.
People who are not drug users?
And gay people who are not drug users. No, there's no such thing.
There's no AIDS in that group.
You see, people don't do that study. What they do is they focus in on AIDS. They're not focusing on not AIDS. And the CDC, 1/3 of all AIDS cases in the U.S., according to the CDC, it's a euphemism for heterosexual drug users. They call it IV drug users. That's 1/3 of the AIDS cases. 2/3, roughly, in round numbers, 2/3 of gay men, all of whom are drug users. Peter and I have looked at all of the so-called cohorts of studies, and most of them are done in gay men. Ever since there was AIDS, there's about 6 or 8 of these cohorts. And not one of these cohorts has a drug-free AIDS patient. Not one. It's in our papers.
I'm sure that you get.
I'm sorry?
There are gay men who don't use great quantities of drugs.
Absolutely.
Those guys don't get AIDS.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right, they don't.
Be sure that's clear.
That's sure. People who don't use the drugs, if you're healthy, you're not hemophiliac or something like that, who already has a problem. If you don't use the drugs, you don't get AIDS. If you're gay and you don't use the drugs, you don't get AIDS. You've heard of the long-term survivors, since the AIDS community is very pessimistic, they prefer to say, they prefer to call it slow progressors.
Yeah.
But guess what they all have in common? In the mainstream AIDS own literature, David Ho has it, other people have it, we've quoted it in this paper that I brought you. Guess what they all have in common? They either never took recreational drugs or the anti-HIV drugs or stopped taking them. That's what all long-term HIV positive survivors have in common. They don't take the drugs.
No, last one. Sorry. If you want to come on down afterwards, you certainly can do that, but it's fine. We've got to let people go to another class. So if you want to ask another question, come on.
Yeah. We're all here. Yeah, I know.